Welcome to Simple Robotics, the podcast, a podcast exploring the animation industry one episode at a time. I'm your host, Monique, and you can find me on all social media platforms at Simple Robotics, SimplyRobotix. And remember to use the hashtag SimplyRoboticsPod when joining in on the conversation. Now, first off, I want to say Happy New Year to you. I want to say thank you for supporting me all of last year with just everything that was 2020. I don't think we need to do any sort of recaps unless you're just going back to listen to some of the episodes, but that's about all the recapping we're going to do. Now, this wasn't going to be the episode I was going to start off the year with, but actually, this was not even on my list of episodes to do, if you will. Some friends just asked me, like, hey, are you going to talk about Soul on your podcast? And I was like, okay. So now I'm talking about Soul. You can watch Soul on Disney Plus. It came out December 25th, 2020, and it's about 140 minutes. I should also mention that there is a exclusive Spotify only podcast for Soul. It's about 5 or 6 episodes, and each episode is about 30 minutes to an hour, and it features conversations or interviews with some of the cast and the directors and probably some other people on the production. I haven't listened to it yet, but it's definitely on my list. Obviously, this is a Pixar movie. I don't think Pixar let us forget for 1 second that it was not a Pixar movie. And it was distributed by Walt Disney Pictures. So the plot via Wiki says the story follows a middle school music teacher named Joe Gardner, who seeks to reunite his soul and his body after they are accidentally separated just before his big break as a jazz musician. I'm going to go through the characters. Joe Gardner, again, passionate jazz pianist, music teacher. 22, who's a soul trapped in the great before, who has a pretty bleak view on life. Then there's Moonwind, who's a spiritual sign twirler, doing all that stuff. Then we have Terry, who's a soul counter, basically like an accountant in the great beyond. Then we have the soul counselors, who are in the great before, and they're all named Jerry, which was like funny at first. I was like, wait, that's Jerry. That's also Jerry. That's Jerry. Okay. Then we have Libba. I believe that's how they pronounce her name. Libba Gardner, who's Joe's mother, and she's a seamstress. Then we have Des, who's Joe's barber. Then we have Lamont Curly Baker. He's a drummer in Dorothea's band, and he was also a former student of Joe's. And we have Dorothea, who's a respected jazz musician and a saxophone player. Starting with the visual style, I felt like Soul did a really good job at capturing modern day New York City. Like, not the 70s, 80s, 90s, but, you know, this, I guess, whatever we're in, to late 2010s, 20s, now we're in the roaring 20s. And one thing I want to point out in particular is the Half Note Jazz Lounge, which Joe goes to, Wolf is frequenting throughout the movie. It is based upon the Blue Note, which is in the West Village in New York City, near, if not exactly on West 4th Street, I think it's on West 4th Street. And I used to work in the area, so seeing that, I was like, oh my gosh, that's like the Blue Note. I'm calling it the Half Note now. I'm getting all confused. So I used to like work in the area, used to hang out in the area. I've actually been to a happy hour, in the Blue Note. I keep calling it the Half Note. And this film really made me miss just like the liveliness and the hustle and bustle of Manhattan, because obviously with the quarantine, I'm not going to Manhattan if it isn't like important. Side tangent, like I had to get my camera lens fixed, so I had to go to Manhattan, and just stuff like getting my computer fixed and like, you know, stuff like that. But we're not hanging out, and though at least I'm not hanging out in the city. I'm not doing things that I was doing, you know, whatever back then. Moving forward, when Joe falls into the manhole and is in what I'm guessing is like a purgatory or something, it's like a transitional space where the background goes from like, okay, you're in New York, then it's black, and like his body is in like this kind of like white outline, and then his soul also becomes this white outline. And this is also, there's like a callback to this moment where Terry, the accountant, accidentally like kills Paul from the barbershop, and Paul's body is now in this black space, and his body is with the same like white chalk outline, and then his soul is also in this outline before it starts transitioning to color. So the reason why I'm picking out this moment in particular is because it's just like a overlooked moment to a certain extent, and also just to show how throughout the film they keep the visual styles very different. Like when you're on Earth, it looks a certain way. When you're in the Great Before or the Great Beyond, it's one way. And then when the spirits or their souls, excuse me, are like transitioning from one to another, they're in like this black abyss with chalk lines. And that part was also 2D animated. So I thought that was pretty interesting. It's like chalk on a blackboard type of thing. Moving forward, for 3D animators out there, I'm not old, but somehow I am dating myself because I feel like the Joe character looks a little similar, or he reminded me of this 3D animation or character rig that we used to use in school called Blake. So I will be posting a link. Oh, I should say I'm going to be mentioning a lot of stuff. So there's going to be a lot of links in the description notes and the show notes, all that sort of stuff. So you can click the link for the Blake rig to see what I'm talking about if you're an animation student. Especially if you're in your like mid to late 20s and older, you may have played around with this rig. I don't know. This rig is officially like 10 years old. Keep moving it forward. When 22 is in Joe's body and 22 like rips his pants, I realized, I was like, this looks very familiar. And it's because that was Queens. They were in the Astoria, Long Island City part of Queens. And this was confirmed by an Instagram page called Meanwhile Back in Queens, where they posted a couple clips showing that, like, okay, this is this part, and this is that part, and this is that part. So there was one part where the train is above the ground, which would be like Queens Borough Plaza, and the trains are going behind this sign, and I think the sign says Silver Cup, and I was like, oh my gosh, I remember seeing that sign like all the time because one, I used to take the train, I used to actually work in that area, and two, when you're driving across the Queensboro Bridge, you see that sign all the time. So the Instagram page also pointed out that they meaning the people, you know, who worked on the movie, the minds behind the movie, consulted with Peter Archer, who was a music school teacher from Bayside, Queens, just to add more authenticity to, like, you know, the movie, making sure the movie's accurate, and just being an overall creative consultant. So when Joe and 22 take the subway, for me, I'm gonna say that was the F&M train stop, 23rd Street, because I used to take that train all the time, going back and forth to college, and I just like everything. I was constantly in that area. So I just felt like they did also a really good job at recreating that station. I mean, also that could have been a bunch of stations in that whole Chelsea kind of flat iron area. But for me, I was like, that's 23rd Street. There were a few stations too. No, I wouldn't say there were a few stations, but I would say that every time they were in the subway, I feel like it was pretty spot on. They did what they had to do with that. The Lost Souls remind me a little bit of the Heartless from Kingdom Hearts. Just, you know, they're just kind of like this, and they're not that ambiguous, you know, but they're just dark. They have kind of just like eyes, and they're like, ooh. So that just was that. I also really appreciated the variety of lighting on black skin and the variety of hairstyles on the men and the women, the black men specifically and the black women. And even in the barbershop, there's a poster like you would find in barbershops, and, you know, in hair salons, there's a one for women or whatever, where there's numbers and you pick what kind of hairstyle that you want. So I thought that that was dope that they incorporated that. That was like a good attention to detail, further adding authenticity to this. I also felt like finally we're seeing black characters with more than a Baldy or an afro, and for women, like we're seeing Black women characters with textured hair, not just straight hair, or also not just an afro. And for me, it's like if Pixar and so many studios like them could have these animals that are like fuzzy and fluffy and all sorts of stuff like that, and they could have these mystical creatures and stuff like that, like why are y'all resorting to this when it comes to Black people's hair? Like, I don't understand it. There's a Twitter thread by Julian Fong, which is linked in the description, which explains the astral plane in The Great Before. He says that Pixar normally is big on using shadows to help visually tell their story. However, in The Great Before, with all the souls, they relied more so on light and how light is bending and interacting with the light from the other souls. So I thought that was interesting, that this is something relatively new that Pixar is doing, in their storytelling. I'm just looking at my notes and I have nothing for animation style. And that's probably because I feel like with every Pixar film, the studio is elevating their style, and there isn't too much to say with that overall. For instance, like it doesn't feel so constrained. All the movements feel very fluid. And also the way that the humans on Earth are moving are so just like my mind is racing. They're just so blatantly different with how the souls move when the souls are in The Great Before, and also with the Jerrys and the Terrys, like they move in a very different way as well. So it's like to see the different, what are we saying, characters coexisting and sometimes in the same spaces, different spaces. I feel like I don't have much to say about like Pixar animation style. They're what all the studios, so many people aspire to. So people aspire to them for a reason, I like the fact that they did have the little 2D stuff in there. I thought that was cool. Yeah, I don't know. I think I also say that they did a great job too with adding lightness. Like the souls don't have any density. They're kind of just floating around when they're in The Great Before, and I think they did a good job with that. In terms of storytelling, there isn't a defined villain, but there's Terry the accountant, and he's a soul that takes his job way too seriously. You just want to be like, Terry, can we dial it back a notch, please? And he's just there to add, like I said, he's the antagonist. Maybe I didn't say that, but he's just there to add some sort of tension, friction, because otherwise there's no conflict in the movie. That's it. After Joe auditions for Dorothea, there's actually multiple like Final Destination moments where he could have died, but he didn't. So for instance, he dodges falling bricks at a construction site. As he's walking down the street, there is like a whole bunch of banana peels on the sidewalk, and he manages not to slip on any of them. He's not looking when he's crossing the street as he's talking on the cell phone, and it's amazing that he doesn't get hit by traffic. All for him to just fall in a manhole and that be like it. Also, Joe asks 22 why 22 sounds like a middle-aged white woman, and they say that they don't, that this is all an illusion and that they can sound like anything. And I'm putting a pin in this for now because I'm going to come back to it a little later. This is a slightly like loaded episode. 22 says that you can't crush a soul in The Great Before, and that's what life is for. And I thought that was like, this movie is deep. This movie is real deep because that's what life is for, crushing souls, man. There's also a part where Moonwind is saying that lost souls are not that different from souls in the zone, and that the zone is enjoyable, but once that joy turns to obsession, one can be disconnected from life. And I thought that was pretty interesting. I feel like throughout the film they get kind of deep. And just, overall Pixar films, I would say within the last 10 years or like, yeah, like 5 to 7 maybe, they've just been getting more like, what is the word? More like into psychology, like literally with Inside Out. So I thought that was pretty interesting too, because even though we have passions and we get in the zone, as we're doing stuff, it can be very obsessive where we are disconnecting from other parts of our life. So I thought that was pretty dope. In terms of storytelling, when 22 is running off with slash in Joe's body because she wants more time to find her spark, I, I mean, I don't know. I thought that was comical. People thought that was a bit problematic. I understand why. I mean, these were just parts of the storytelling experiences that I wanted to highlight, but being a bit not even that much more critical, like Pixar has their story structure, right? That you can I didn't have it in my show notes or whatever, but it's like they follow a rhythm and a pattern to the way that they tell their stories, right? So I don't feel like they can really, I mean, they can tell a story wrong, but Pixar is always about perfecting their storytelling. So obviously, I feel like, you know, they did a good job with it. I feel like the Joe and 22, well, 22 landing in Joe's body, Joe landing in a cat was pretty good for like a nice little spin so that the story wasn't too predictable, because now you're like, how is Joe going to get back to his body? What's going to happen to 22? So, but that still follows their Pixar story structure. And maybe in a different episode, I would talk a little bit about like that structure. Yeah, I can put that on the back burner to happen later. And I will point out with a couple of their movies how they follow those different patterns. But moving on to a bunch of final thoughts, and then there's like a part two that's kind of gonna happen in here. Joe dies at about 9.5 minutes into the movie, and then he becomes human around 73 minutes into the movie, which leaves about 36 minutes of the movie remaining when he's like Joe, So unlike, let's say, The Prince and the Frog, The Emperor's New Groove, Brother Bear, where the main character is an animal or not themselves for a whole time, we do see Joe's body in action on screen for a long period of time, but it's in fact 22 and it's not Joe. So I counted from when Joe's soul is back in his body was about 73 minutes into the movie. When the principal, this should have gone into the visual parts, but when the principal calls Joe out into the hallway to tell him that he's been promoted, I really was looking at it like, wow, these hallways, they look kind of bleak, but they remind me of my junior high, like where the top is like a wall and the bottom is like this brick structure thing, and the wooden doors and like all that sort of stuff. I'm like, that's exactly how at least New York City junior highs look like. When Joe ends up on that path to the great beyond, I was looking at it, I was like, damn, a lot of people are dying. Like a lot of people are dead. Like I guess sometimes you don't think about how many people on a global scale, I guess, die per minute. But yeah, there's also mentioned, I'm pretty sure one of the Jerry's mentioned this, that soul mentors are paired with soulmates. I thought that was a cute play on words, because we think of soulmates as being something that's more romantic and even like friendship soulmates or platonic stuff, but to think of soulmates actually happening in the great before, where your soul is being mentored by another soul, I think is pretty interesting. There were a lot of greats that couldn't get through to Joe, from Mother Teresa and Muhammad Ali and all that sort of stuff, but Joe, who's a regular nobody, quote quote, was able to help 22 find their spark. That, that was kind of cool. When Joe and Soul, well, when not Joe and Soul, when 22 is in Joe's body and they're at his apartment and she's like taking a shower or whatever, and I was just thinking like, Does every kid's movie really need to have a butt joke? And not that this bothered me, that I was like, oh my gosh, but I was like, I knew we were gonna get a butt joke, and the butt joke was that 22 was like, I even washed your butt for you. And I was like, oh gosh. But one of the Jerrys told Joe that a spark isn't a soul's purpose, and that goes back into like the whole lost soul thing, and that the whole obsession over your passion or your spark disconnects you from life. That was pretty good. I think sometime in like the early to mid 2000s it became a thing to have celebrities voice animated characters. Like prior to that it was no names. It was probably like people from Broadway or something like that, or just like distinguished voice actors, but now it's always celebrities. So the first time I watched the film, I didn't feel like Jamie Foxx's voice really was overbearing or distracted me or took me out of the movie. But when I watched it the second time, it did a little bit. But what was good is that it was a pretty star-studded cast, and none of their voices was really distracting or annoying. I don't even think Tina Fey's voice wasn't that annoying. I thought that although I appreciate jazz being the backdrop of this film, I'm just a tad bit tired of, um, even though I understand it and I appreciate Black culture being celebrated, I'm just like, why do we keep lumping with like jazz? Like, why is it jazz, 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 Black people and jazz, like Princess and the Frog, duh, because they're in NOLA, they had jazz, and then now there's more jazz. So, I also feel like I don't like what I said when I was talking about Trolls World Tour a little bit, where like, and even in Over the Moon, and when non-black people start doing like hip hop and rap and animated movies, it's just not good. It's just not good. Don't like it, don't want it. So, on that note, I will say, according to Apple, one of my most played albums of 2020 was the soundtrack to The Photograph, which was directed by Stella Meggy, and it was starring Issa Rae and Lakeith Stanfield. So the soundtrack is mainly jazz and like super chill music, just like relaxing stuff. And I feel like, even though I haven't listened to the Soul soundtrack just yet, I think that it's going to be that same type of thing. And I really want to listen to it. I also really miss how like animated movies used to have soundtracks. Lion King, a Goofy movie, Tarzan, The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast. Like soundtracks, hits. So I wish that instead of having pop music just be placed into songs, talking to you trolls, I wish that we would actually create, Anastasia, like create music for these things. This is where I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk about some things that I came across the internet. Now, I feel that there was really so people were saying so much about Soul from the moment it started. I was like, give this thing a break, give this thing a chance. Like it was like 10 o'clock in the morning on Christmas and I'm already seeing people saying stuff about Soul, and I'm like, damn. Like, can we have breakfast first? Like, what if people wanted to watch this in the night with their families? Like, what if it's whatever, So this is like gonna be a little segment called What the Internet Said. First thing was the authenticity of Black people and Black culture. This film was co-written and co-directed by Kemp Powers. He was brought on to add more authenticity to Joe Gardner. In this article by the Washington Post, which, as I've said, the link is in the show notes so you can read this for yourself or skim through it or whatever, Kemp Powers says, this was good. Time out, this is my generation. He's 47. He appreciates hip hop's popular sampling of such artists such as Herbie Hancock. They're symbiotic. My generation adores jazz. And that's why I think we keep getting jazz being so tightly associated with Black characters because of the generation that's telling these stories. Like Joe Gardner, which also makes sense, is in his 40s. So Kemp Powers being in his 40s, and Kemp Powers is from Brooklyn and that's where he grew up. So it's like, he's seeing himself in Joe Gardner, which makes sense. But I think what makes Miles Morales and Into the Spider-Verse so like invigorating and so relatable to millennials and younger is because of the hip hop influence of it. So that kind of just like makes sense with these two relatively, not relatively, but these two new black animated characters being Miles Morales and Joe Gardner, hip hop and jazz. Just seeing, even though the directors were the same, like are the same age as Kemp Powers, it's more about the characters. Hip hop makes sense for Miles Morales, whereas it could have made sense too for Kemp Powers, to be honest. Not Kemp Powers, but for Joe Gardner. But I get it. Jazz makes more sense. So I just like would like to start seeing some more like hip hop. I would like to start seeing some more alternative like R&B. I want to see some R&B and some blues too, though not too much blues, but more like R&B. Like, you know, I want to get more into the variety of music that black people make, you know. So keeping to move forward, long story short, there's links in the description. They're all titled. There's only 1 out of 19 white-led Walt Disney Animation Studio films where the character changes or is an animal for most of the film, compared with 3 out of 10 POC characters. And this is from Walt Disney Confessions Rage Tumblr post. So yeah, and you see how we're lumping POC characters, so we're not even getting into black, we're not getting into Indian, Native American, what is it, Pacific Islander, indigenous. Like, once you start trying to break it down like that, it's even worse. Moving on to the next thing that I saw them talk about on the internet was the white gaze. So I saw a tweet of someone expressing that, and I quote, I wasn't sure if I really wanted to put the person's username and stuff like that in this, but what they said was someone at the highest levels of production decided that the movie wouldn't sell unless blackness was erased and inhabited by whiteness. So another sentiment that echoes that was this article on Gizmodo titled Soul Feels Like Pixar's First Black Movie Made with White People in Mind, and that was written by Charles Pulliam Moore. And this excerpt, he says, for all the promise that Soul had of being Pixar's big-bodied, full-throated love letter to jazz music that centered a black lead, in the end, the movie barely delivers in any substantive way. By featuring a smattering of gorgeous visuals, spotlighting different black skin tones and hair textures, Soul shows us that the studio has the technical skills to make movies like Soul shine aesthetically. But when it comes to telling stories that don't find a way to center white people and their gazes, Soul proves that Pixar is out of its depth. So I completely understand that, and I don't disagree with it. I feel like by having Joe not be in his body, by having 22 be in his body, and also 22's voice is a white woman, so I understand how people feel like, well, it's a white woman in a man's body. And especially, like I said, when 22 runs away because she doesn't want to leave Joe's body, and it's like a white woman hijacking a black man's body, it's like I understand and I get it, and I don't think that anybody's wrong. I do think that a lot of times when we have big budget, big feature, movies in general, that they are trying to appease the masses. So maybe if it's not number 1 or 2 on their list, they still want to make sure more often than not that middle America is able to digest this movie, especially if it's going to get a theatrical release. You want them to be the ones to go to see it. Like, the people in the big cities and the metro cities, they're going to see it anyway, but that's not where most of the money is. Especially if we're starting to talk about international stuff. But I think the way that we help to reimage and to spread positive messages about black people and who black people are after years and years and generations of just, I want to say like propaganda about black people, I think anybody that wants to tell stories where black characters are the leads, like, is going to have to go through with it. We can't do any, they become a pigeon, they become a frog, they die and they're a soul now, all that sort of stuff. We can't do those gimmicks anymore. Like, I understand that it's animation, and animation is magic and fantastical, and things can happen in animation that can't happen in live action. But if you're going to take this on as a responsibility, then you have to go through it to the end and let this character be black and be human the whole time. I will say on that note, however, a lot of Joe's life that we were experiencing as 22 was still very black and very authentic. The whole barbershop, the way his mom in the tailor shop, and her employees, the way they're having their like little girl talk, their mannerisms, a lot of the things that they say they do, the way that they're walking, it felt very black all the time still. So it's like two things can be true and two things can be right at the same time, but it doesn't negate all these things that's been expressed, and it doesn't mean that we won't continue to hold people who are not black, who choose to make characters black for whatever reason, accountable. I saw a tweet. I don't even know who said this anymore. I thought I screenshot it. Who knows? I saw a tweet calling Joe Gardner a magical Negro, and I was like, there's something interesting there. So the definition of a magical Negro is a supporting stock character who comes to the aid of a white protagonist in a film. Magical Negro characters who often possess special insight or mystical powers have long been a tradition in American fiction. The character is typically, but not always, in some way outwardly or inwardly disabled, either by discrimination, disability, or social constraint. The Negro is often a janitor or a prisoner. What is it? The Green Mile? Is that what I hear? The character often has no past, but simply appears one day to help the white protagonist. He or she usually has some sort of magical power, rather vaguely defined, but not the sort of thing one typically encounters. The character is patient, wise, often dispensing various words of wisdom, and is closer to the earth. The character will also do almost anything, including sacrificing him or herself to save the white protagonist. So I got that all from Wiki, where I get everything from. So I'm sure that as I read off that description, that you saw a little bit of Joe Gardner there. I don't think it's a reach, or maybe it's not that big of a reach to call Joe a magical Negro, and it's an animated film, but if you view 22 as being a white character, and Joe Gardner, who is supposed to be the lead of the film, is actually there to help her find the purpose of life or something, then I can see that. Isn't he offering words of wisdom? Isn't he closer to earth because he's actually living there? Like, he's a soul that has lived life. Like, he has his own struggles and stuff like that, but like in the end, isn't he ready to die again so that 22 can actually experience life and go out there and live on earth and stuff like that? So I understood what they were getting at too. It's one of those things again where like it's not completely wrong or right. To wrap this up, I will read this quote from Dorothea, where she says, "I heard this story about a fish. He swims up to an older fish and says, 'I'm trying to find this thing they call the ocean.' 'The ocean?' the older fish says. 'That's what you're in right now. This,' says the young fish. 'This is water. What I want is the ocean.'" And I mean, when I heard that, I was like, oh, this one just keeps getting deep. Like deep, and no pun into the ocean, but like, dang, the deepness. But I was like, wow, that's just like, this whole movie and talking about like sparks and purpose and being in the zone and being obsessive and being a lost soul. And then now the fish is in the ocean, but the fish considers the ocean to be water, which is not false, but it's not the magic that the fish is looking for. And it just made me feel like, we always going to aspire to something more than whatever it is that we're doing or wherever it is that we're at. And, just like to think about what is satisfaction to you, what is like actually sitting and absorbing and enjoying the wins that we have and the small things that we achieve and just kind of stuff like that, because every time we accomplish a goal or hit that next step of whatever it is that we're doing, we just want whatever comes next. Like, we don't always take the time. And then also sometimes what we're aspiring to is just, it's not what we thought it would be, which is what was happening to Joe at the end. So there's still like, I still want to sit with that quote personally and think about it, maybe write and journal and stuff about it. But I just thought that was really good. So thank you for tuning into this episode, for listening, for watching. Again, you can find me on all social media platforms at Simply Robotics, SIMPLYROBOTIX. The next episode is the episode I've been waiting for. Like, I was waiting for the Spider-Verse episode, but it's the Avatar and Legend of Korra episode. That's what's next. So stay tuned. When you listen to this episode, let me know that you're listening. Use the hashtag Simply Robotics Pod. And until next time, bye.